Good evening, morning, yesterday, tomorrow, whenever you happen to be listening. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, everyone else, to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. For today's episode, we're looking into something that's a bit of a spiritual sequel to the last episode on Spring-Heeled Jack, covering another interesting figure from history, as well as modern day, who may or may not be of strange and otherworldly origins. So without further ado, let's jump into the fascinating story of the Red Man of the Tuileries, as well as the NAIN ROUGE, or Red Dwarf, of Detroit. Let's go! There are certain ghosts that haunt houses, ghosts that haunt battlefields, ghosts that haunt families, ghosts that haunt my bathroom, and then there are ghosts that seem to haunt history itself. This episode concerns the potentially ongoing story of two, but it might be one. They may be the same figure. That figure. A strange being. A man, a phantom, dressed in red. A figure allegedly seen by kings, queens, emperors, courtiers, revolutionaries, and common citizens across centuries of French history. A figure said to appear before disasters, executions, revolutions, and the complete collapse of whole entire governments. A figure who walked the halls of one of the most powerful buildings in Europe and who, according to legend, delivered warnings to those who stood at the center of history's turning points. He was once known as the Red Man of the Tuileries. I want to make sure I'm getting that right. Tuileries. The Red Man of the Tuileries. Keep things simple, I'm just going to call him the Red Man. But as our story progresses, we shall find that he may have actually adopted a few other identities as history continues to unfold into the present day and tomorrow. Sha-na-na-na. At first glance, the tale sounds like little more than a traditional ghost story, a palace specter or a court legend. The kind of story servants whisper to one another in dark corridors in between hushed discussions of how much they hate working for their bosses. But the deeper one digs, the stranger the legend becomes, because the Red Man isn't merely attached to a building. He seems to be attached to power itself. Unlike most hauntings, the story doesn't revolve around a murder victim's restless ghost seeking revenge, nor a spirit unable to find rest. Instead, alright, just a quick production note. My cat is trying to dig into books for some reason. I don't understand why. So, if you keep hearing persistent noises in the background, I apologize for that. I don't know what it is. He thinks he can read. Isn't that adorable? Anywho. So yeah. Sorry. Apologies. Instead, the Red Man appears to be a herald of some sort, a messenger, and a witness. A living omen whose appearances are said to coincide with moments when entire political systems begin to crack. And perhaps most fascinating of all, the Red Man may represent something much older than a simple ghost. He may belong to a category of entities that's followed human civilization for thousands of years. The spirit of the city, the genius loci, the guardian, the watcher, the thing that emerges wherever enough human ambition, violence, fear, and belief become concentrated in one place. To understand the Red Man, we first have to understand the world that created him. And that means beginning not with Napoleon nor the French Revolution, but with one of the absolute most feared and powerful women in all of French history. Few historical figures have accumulated a reputation quite like Catherine de' Medici. To some historians, she was a capable ruler, navigating an impossible political landscape, while to others, she became the living embodiment of court intrigue itself. Poisonings, assassinations, astrology, prophecy, and conspiracy all become associated with her name. For centuries, stories accumulated around her like layers of invisible, odorless filth. Some of them were true, many were not. Together, they transformed Catherine into a kind of occult queen haunting the popular imagination. Now, this intertwines with a great deal of Belle Epoque and I believe it's, what's the other term? Fin de siècle. Fin de siècle? I think that's how you say it. My French is non-existent, so I apologize. But the overlapping of occultism with legit power structures, etc., goes very deep. And I'm actually working on a side series. Well, not it's part of the regular show, but a whole series that will go very in-depth to all of the popular occultism, if there is such a thing. It's kind of a oxymoron, but I think you get what I'm saying. Yeah, multiple episodes are in the works that will greatly delve into all of this stuff. Magical battles, etc. We've already covered the Taxil hoax. I think that was our first episode that I did with the fellas back in the day. But we're going to get very deep into that stuff, so this is kind of adjacent to that. But just having said that, I just wanted to let everyone know that we're not going to get too deep into that stuff this episode, but just letting you know that the popular French occultism of the time, Satanism, all this kind of stuff, all the intrigues around it, will be coming soon. So just watch this space. Anywho, a lot of interjections and notifications today. Sorry, back to the story. The France of the 16th century was a nation racked by religious conflict. Catholics and Protestants fought bitterly for influence. Plots multiplied, assassinations were a constant fear, and prophecies circulated widely. Astrologers enjoyed tremendous influence among Europe's ruling elite. The future wasn't viewed as an unknown quantity. It was viewed as something that could potentially be glimpsed, manipulated, or even negotiated. This was the world that would ultimately give birth to the legend of the Red Man. According to later versions of the story, Catherine employed a mysterious figure known as Jean? We're going to go with Jean. Jean the Skinner. The details vary wildly, depending on the source. But in some tellings, he's a butcher, in others a magician, and in others still an astrologer, poisoner, or practitioner of forbidden dark arts. Either way, the specifics matter less than the role he plays. He becomes the archetypal occult advisor, the worm tongue, the eminence grise, a shadowy figure operating behind political power, and a recurring character in folklore across countless cultures. In the grimiest corners of Paris, he was known as Jean le Cochien, or Jean the Skinner. To the superstitious public, the moniker was literal. Some whispered he was a brutal German butcher who ran a slaughterhouse on the very tile kilns Catherine seized to build her estate, while others claimed he earned his name as the Queen's personal cold-blooded enforcer, quite literally skinning her political enemies alive. But in the underworld of the court, his skinning took on an even darker, more metaphorical meaning. Jean was a collector of secrets, a man who peeled back the layers of polite society to expose the raw, bleeding underbelly of the royal court's deepest scandals. He knew who was being poisoned, who was buying love potions, and exactly which high-ranking necks were on Catherine's secret chopping block. They say his bloodlust wasn't born in the halls of power, but in the sawdust of the awful pits. Awful, awful, awful. The rumors claim that Jean didn't just slaughter livestock. He conducted grotesque, late-night anatomical experiments on the vagrants and beggars of Paris. When Catherine's men cleared the tile kilns to break ground on the Tuileries, they allegedly found human remains mixed carelessly with animal bones beneath his shop, skeletons entirely stripped of their skin, hanging from meat hooks like macabre tapestries. There's this stomach-churning talent for clean, quiet flaying that supposedly caught the Queen's attention in the first place, turning a local butcher into the crown's most depraved secret weapon. The stories of his executions were whispered like campfire ghost stories among the Parisian elite. If a rival lord spoke out against the Queen, they would vanish from their beds, only for their family to receive a horrific parcel days later. A neatly folded parchment, not of vellum, but of the missing noble's own skin, inscribed with an alchemical curse written in their blood. In the most extreme tellings, Jean didn't just kill for political convenience. he was rumored to perform human sacrifices in the dead of night, extracting the still beating hearts of young targets to brew the life-prolonging elixirs and toxic poisons Catherine used to control the court. Now, I've been getting really deep into the intersection of political power and sorcery lately. There's going to be a lot of it coming down the pipeline. It's deeper than I thought. It's very interesting, and the implications for today are potentially quite staggering. Anywho, he was a monster. Jean the Skinner, go figure. The monster who took his name entirely too seriously. Folklore insists that when Jean was tasked with interrogating a captive, he didn't use standard torture. He used a specialized Skinner's knife, peeling the flesh from a victim's fingers millimeter by millimeter until they confessed. The horror wasn't just the pain, it was the clinical, absolute silence with which he worked. He would systematically strip a person of their dignity, their skin, and their secrets, leaving a bloody, breathing mass on the floor, all while whispering the court gossip he just extracted back to the dying victim. And while it reads like a modern horror script, the paper trail for Jean's bloody ghost stretches back centuries, whispered in the military memoirs of Napoleon's own generals, pinned into Gothic poetry by 19th century writers like Pierre-Jean de Béranger, and thoroughly documented by French folklorists like Gérard de Nerval. Eventually, according to the legend, Catherine had him killed, perhaps to silence him, either because he knew too much or perhaps because folklore demands a violent ending. But whatever the reason, the story claims his body was hidden near the grounds of the Tuileries, a magnificent royal palace and garden estate located on the right bank of the Seine River in Paris. And from that moment onward, something remained. The murdered advisor became an apparition. The apparition became a warning, and the warning became a legend. And thus, the Red Man was born. What makes his origin particularly interesting is how neatly it reflects the anxieties of the time. The 16th century was obsessed with hidden influences, invisible powers, secret advisors, and unknown conspiracies operating behind the machinery of the government. Because they were happening. It was there. The Red Man embodies all these fears. He emerges from the shadows of political power and refuses to leave. The atmospheric shadow didn't just linger in the gossip of courtly halls. It seemed to lock into a wider, pre-existing current of European dread. Folklorists have long noted that the legend of Jean the Skinner's Crimson Phantom maps terrifyingly well onto the ancient British and Celtic archetype of the Red Cap. In Anglo-Scottish border lore, the Red Cap is a malicious, murderous hobgoblin that haunts ruined castles and sites of intense historical slaughter. He's defined by a singular sickening trait. He must regularly drench his heavy cap in the fresh blood of human victims to sustain his own life, and if the blood dries, he vanishes. By transforming the murdered royal court enforcer into a scarlet-clad specter, the Parisian public effectively manifested their own urban Red Cap. A manifestation born not of rural ruins, but of a crown built on top of state-sanctioned bloodshed, permanently staining the metaphysical foundations of the palace. In fact, the architectural site of the Tuileries itself seemed cosmically marked for this violent collision long before the first foundation stone was ever even laid. Nearly a decade before Catherine de' Medici broke ground on her new estate, her legendary court seer, Michel Nostradamus, again, sorry, pardon my French, penned a deeply unsettling prophecy in 1555. Recorded in Century 9, Quatrain 34, the verse reads, "The husband, left alone, shall be crowned with a meter," like the Masonic meter. "The return, conflict, shall pass over the tile. By 500, one who betrays shall be elevated. Narbonne and sauce shall have oil by the quart." Obviously, this could mean only one thing, and one thing only. But for real, for generations, the cryptic second line, quote, "conflict shall pass over the tile," unquote, baffled various interpreters who assumed that the prophet was speaking of a simple roof, but the truth was buried in the dirt. The word Tuileries literally derives from the ancient clay tile kilns, les Tuileries, that once occupied the land. In the esoteric traditions of Paris, it's whispered that Nostradamus didn't just guess the future, but was tapping into the raw residual spiritual current of the site, foreseeing the exact geographical coordinates where political power and supernatural vengeance would end up intersecting. Over time, the story evolves, as they tend to do. The Red Man is no longer merely a ghost. He becomes something stranger, a prophet, a herald of catastrophe, a figure whose appearances seem linked to moments when history itself begins to shift. And soon, France would experience one of the greatest shifts in its entire existence. A revolution that would forever transform both the nation, the world, and the legend of the Red Man. By the time France reached the late 18th century, the legend of the Red Man had already begun to detach itself from any single origin story. What began as a courtly rumor tied to Catherine de' Medici and the shadowy figure of Jean the Skinner gradually shifted into something broader and more politically charged. Tuileries Palace, already a seat of royal authority, became, in the contemporary popular imagination, a kind of pressure chamber, where history itself accumulated tension. Within that charged environment, the Red Man was no longer simply a murdered advisor returned from the dead. He became an omen attached to the fate of the monarchy itself. Accounts from later folkloric retellings describe sightings of an enigmatic red-clad figure moving through the gardens and corridors of the Tuileries in the years leading up to major upheavals. These stories didn't present the apparition as overtly threatening, but instead described him as quietly present, often seen from a distance, only to vanish when approached, or appearing only briefly in one's peripherals. What makes these accounts significant within the legend isn't interaction, but timing. The Red Man is said to appear before moments of collapse, as though his presence is less an intervention than a notification that something irreversible is already underway. When the French Revolution erupted, the Tuileries ceased to be merely a royal residence and became a focal point of political violence. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were confined within its walls, and the building itself became a symbol of the old order under siege. In later interpretations of the legend, this period becomes one of the strongest anchors for Red Man sightings. Sorry, I just keep thinking of Method Man to the side. The figure is said to have been glimpsed within the palace corridors during moments of unrest, as if pacing the boundaries between the collapsing monarchy and the rising revolutionary state. Whether these accounts reflect actual sightings, retrospective myth-making, or symbolic storytelling is impossible to determine, but their persistence is what gives the legend its structure. What's more important is how the Red Man begins to function within this larger historical framework. He's no longer simply a ghost associated with a building. He becomes something closer to a narrative force within the story of France itself. A figure that appears when political systems reach a critical threshold. A presence that seems less concerned with individuals than with transitions of power. In this sense, the Red Man begins to resemble older European traditions of omen figures, but filtered through the specific anxieties of state collapse and revolution. As the monarchy fell and revolution unfolded, the Tuileries transformed from a royal palace to a contested space of ideology and violence. And in the folklore that developed afterwards, the Red Man remained attached to that space, as though he'd become part of its identity. Not a resident, but a function. Not a victim, but a signal. And from there, the legend doesn't fade. Instead, it intensifies with the arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte. With the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Red Man legend undergoes yet another transformation. The figure that once seemed to be tied to the anxieties of monarchy and revolution now shifts into the language of empire. Napoleon himself becomes a natural focal point for supernatural narratives. His rapid ascent, military genius, and eventual coronation as Emperor of France invites multiple new layers of myth, speculation, and retrospective symbolism. Within some versions of the Red Man tradition, Napoleon is said to have encountered the figure during his time connected to the Tuileries and its surrounding political structures. These accounts vary widely, but they consistently frame the Red Man not as an enemy or attacker, but as a presence that appears amidst moments of monumental decisions or transitions. In some tellings, he's seen briefly in palace corridors, while in others, he's associated with moments of reflection or isolation, as though appearing when leadership itself becomes burdened by the weight of consequence. It's during this period that the Red Man begins to emerge more explicitly with the idea of prophecy. Rather than merely signaling disaster, he becomes associated with foreknowledge, a figure that seems to stand slightly outside of the normal flow of time, observing outcomes before they fully arrive. This shift is subtle but important, because it moves the legend away from the idea of a typical haunting and closer towards the idea of intelligence or agency embedded within cycles of historical events themselves. Napoleon's later association with Egypt only deepens the transformation. His expedition to Egypt and the subsequent rise of Egyptomania, mummy smuggling, and various pyramid schemes throughout Europe introduced a whole new layer of esoteric interpretations into his legacy. Among the most enduring myths is the story that Napoleon spent a night alone inside of the Great Pyramid of Giza, emerging profoundly shaken and refusing to discuss what had occurred within. Historically, there's no reliable evidence confirming this event, but its persistence in the popular imagination is rather significant. The story functions less as a biography and more like something of an initiation narrative. A ruler confronting something ancient, hidden, and ineffable within the symbolic heart of a much older and eternally mysterious civilization. It's in this expanded mythical framework the Red Man and Napoleon begin to occupy adjacent roles. One is a mysterious figure who appears at the thresholds of political transformation. The other is a figure who embodies transformation itself. Both become associated with moments where history seems to exceed the control of those who are shaping it. And as Napoleon's empire rises and eventually falls, the Red Man remains embedded in the same symbolic landscape, shifting from monarchy to revolution to empire, without ever losing his connection to the Tuileries as a site of concentrated political energy. At this point in the legend, the question begins to shift. It's no longer simply who or what the Red Man was, but rather, why does this figure seem to appear specifically during moments when political reality is about to be drastically altered? That question opens the door to a much wider pattern, one that extends beyond France alone and into the recurring appearance of red-clad omen figures in other cities and traditions. Once the Red Man of the Tuileries is placed alongside other folkloric systems, something interesting begins to happen. The figure stops looking like a uniquely French court apparition and starts resembling a broader category of omen entity that appears in multiple urban traditions, each one adapted to local history but sharing a surprisingly consistent function. The most direct modern parallel is the Detroit figure, known as the NAIN ROUGE, or Red Dwarf, a small red-skinned being said to appear before periods of misfortune, social upheaval, and or absolute civic disaster. That's all. Nothing major. The NAIN ROUGE tradition, associated with Detroit folklore, describes a red dwarf-like entity whose appearances are interpreted as warnings of coming trouble and tribulation. In some accounts, it's been linked to early colonial narratives and frontier superstitions, while in others, it becomes a later urban legend that evolved alongside the city's industrial rise and decline. What matters most isn't a fixed origin point, but the role the figure plays within local storytelling. The NAIN ROUGE isn't a ghost tied to a single building or death, but a civic omen, a personality attached to the very fate of Detroit itself. Now, before we get into these various historical accounts of red dwarf sightings and encounters, which would precede an immensely grim array of historical misfortunes, I want you all to try to lock in within your mind's eye visual representations of just what this entity might look like to you. In order to help you get started, may I make two quick suggestions? I suggest maybe either a color palette switched crimson infernal imp in the tradition of Warwick Davis's much-beloved Leprechaun film franchise, but replacing all of the Irish stereotypes with filthy, drunk, perverted, cheese-eating surrender monkey stereotypes instead. Big ups to France. Thanks for taking it all in stride. De Gaulle was one badass and we'll say, fuck yeah. Or, if that's not your particular cup of Tabasco - Bloody Mary, my mind went directly to the little dancing man in the red suit from the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks. But with a much more manic and disturbing turbo mode malicious mischief setting as he simultaneously zip-zap-zops across time from one horrific incident in Detroit's history to the next, whilst also incessantly giggling viciously in the backwards warped audio he's so well known for. But of course, these are merely just suggestions to help you get started. Your journey is your own. Shine on, you crazy diamond. Alright, anyway, everybody set? Let's go. So, the paper trail of the Nain Rouge, sometimes also called the Demon of the Strait, is punctuated by numerous specific catastrophic dates where historical records and urban legends collide. While oral traditions claim that the entity was born from Norman French folklore regarding the mischievous lutin or hobgoblin, its modern reputation as a pure harbinger of doom was formally codified in Marie Caroline Watson Hamlin's foundational 1883 book, Legends of Le Detroit, aka Detroit. Hamlin's text records that the city's very founder, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, was warned by a fortune teller to appease the creature, but instead, upon encountering the red-faced, sharp-toothed imp in the woods, an arrogant Cadillac struck it with his cane and shouted, quote, "Get out of my way, you red imp," unquote, dooming his personal fortunes and unlocking a curse upon the geography itself, completely fucking over multiple generations to come. From that foundational insult onwards, the creature supposedly materialized on the eve of the city's greatest historical traumas. On July 30th, 1763, witnesses claimed to see the Red Dwarf pacing the banks of the Detroit River just before the Battle of Bloody Run, where Chief Pontiac's warriors brutally ambushed British forces, leaving 58 soldiers dead and the river literally stained red with blood. Decades later, in the spring of 1805, the crimson figure was spotted frantically racing through the muddy streets of the settlement. Days later, a massive fire entirely consumed Detroit, reducing every single home except one to nothing but a flaming pile of fucked-to-death ashes. During the War of 1812, General William Hull explicitly reported catching a glimpse of the dwarf leering at him through a dense fog just before he made the highly controversial and universally condemned decision to unconditionally surrender Fort Detroit to British forces without firing a single shot. You got punked out and done bitched out, Hull. Even as Detroit transitioned from a colonial frontier to a sprawling 20th century industrial powerhouse, the phantasmagorical sightings kept pace with the shifting landscape. On a hot summer night in July of 1967, utility workers reported a small, hideous creature executing bizarre backflips and cartwheels down 12th Street. Hours later, a police raid ignited the devastating 1967 Detroit riots, one of the most destructive civil uprisings in American history. Nearly a decade later, in March of 1976, two Detroit Edison linemen watched in disbelief as what looked like a small child climbed a utility pole, only for the entity to drop to the ground, leer at them viciously, and then just scamper away into the darkness. Within 48 hours, the worst ice storm in all of Michigan's recorded history completely crippled the region, leaving over 400,000 residents completely without power. However, the supernatural timeline didn't freeze in the 70s. The creature simply traded the ice and smoke of the mid-century for the neon bar signs and economic anxieties of the modern era. In the spring of 1993, during a period of intense municipal tension and financial restructuring, two separate individuals reported seeing a small, red-furred figure dressed in tattered old-world rags crawling across the roof of a vacant Michigan Central station, its eyes reflecting the passing headlights like a wild animal's. Just weeks later, one of the most devastating floods in Michigan history drowned the regional infrastructure, causing over $60 million in damages. Even as recently as March 2020, just days before the global pandemic initiated a total societal lockdown, grounding Detroit's automotive industrial heart to a dead stop, transit workers near the subterranean New Center area reported catching a fleeting glimpse of a hunched crimson figure scampering into an abandoned subway tunnel, leaving behind a faint smell of sulfur and ozone. Who's that ozone again? Sulfur we've heard of. It's the ozone. It's very interesting. Electrical shenanigans afoot. This modern rhythm brings us directly to the edge of the city's most infamous autumn tradition, Devil's Night. The connection between the NAIN Rouge and the arson-fueled chaos of October 30th is a crucial piece of local psychogeography. Folklorists and cultural researchers note that the creature's seasonal mythology naturally bled into the modern tradition, with some older residents viewing the escalating fires of the late 20th century not merely as your standard good old-fashioned mom-and-pop vandalism, but as a reoccurring massive-scale civic ritual. A modern industrial echo of the 1805 fire that the Red Imp originally presided over. In the local imagination, the Nain Rouge isn't just an omen of these specific fires. It functions as the hidden spiritual instigator of the underlying rage that fuels them. Because it represents the ultimate trickster-turned-arsonist archetype, the Red Dwarf is structurally linked to that specific tension-packed night, with the line betwixt the city's literal physical architecture and its destructive internal fire completely burns away. When viewed through the lens of psychogeography and the mechanics of folklore, this modern rhythm reveals an incredibly deep, dark hypothesis. The devastation of Devil's Night may actually function as an unconscious, mass-scale, ritualistic burnt offering. While there's no official written historical document from the 1800s stating that the city must burn to appease the imp, the structural behavior of the phenomenon suggests that the community has spent decades paying a blood and ash debt that it doesn't even realize it owes. To understand why Devil's Night looks like a sacrificial offering, one has to go back to the original terms of the curse. When Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac first encountered the Nain Rouge, the local fortune teller didn't instruct him to conquer or destroy the creature. She explicitly warned him that he must appease it with respect and humility. However, Cadillac struck it with his cane, defaulting on the spiritual transaction and driving the debt deep into the city's collective unconscious. Because the Nain Rouge's first major civic masterstroke was the Great Fire of 1805, which entirely erased the old colonial footprint, fire became the creature's signature medium and language. By the time the calendar turned to the late 20th century, the sudden astronomical pyromaniacal explosions of arson on October 30th began to look less like random vandalism and more like a psychological dam breaking. The community was unconsciously paying the tax that Cadillac refused to honor, offering up the city's physical architecture as burnt sacrificial offerings to the ancient red-faced devil of the strait. There's a hyper-specific, ritualistic geometry to how these fires operated. They occurred exclusively on the temporal threshold night before Halloween, and for decades they predominantly targeted abandoned homes, vacant lots, and decaying structures. It was rarely an indiscriminate destruction of the living city. It was an extraction of the dead weight, as if the city were ritualistically shedding its dead skin through flame and feeding the neglected spaces of a collapsing industrial empire to a ravenous trickster. Now, I've actually got an upcoming episode in the works that's going to cover Devil's Night and various other historical precedents and or real-world equivalents of the Purge in much further depth and detail, so stay tuned. It's coming very soon. The ultimate evidence that Detroit understands this relationship on a deeper, instinctual level lies in how the city finally began to combat the October chaos. In 2010, local citizens established the Marche du Nain Rouge, a massive theatrical parade held every spring where thousands gathered to confront a costumed representation of the Red Dwarf, banish him from the city limits, and burn him in effigy. Might not be the best route to go, but that's what they've chosen, and that's what they've stuck with. The esoteric irony here is somewhat staggering. To finally quench the literal chaotic fires of Devil's Night, the city was forced to invent a new, highly structured, fully conscious ritual that still fundamentally relies on the exact same elements, the NAIN rouge and a consuming fire. The community merely shifted from unconsciously burning its own neighborhoods to feed this hunger to consciously burning the entity himself to assert control. In both eras, the city remains entirely incapable of escaping the reality that its relationship with this ancient presence must always be mediated through ritual applications of flames, smoke, and ash. When placed next to the Red Man of the Tuileries, the resemblance isn't literal but functional. Both figures are red, obviously. Both are associated with moments of instability. Both appear at the thresholds of transformation rather than amidst periods of stability, and both are described less as interactive beings and more as phantasmagorical presences that are more accurately simply just glimpsed, interpreted, and or later integrated into narratives of catastrophe. In both cases, the figure functions as a kind of interpretive lens through which communities can later organize their collective memory around moments of crisis. This is where the pattern begins to widen beyond individual legends. Across different cultural contexts, cities and regions often produce what can be described as harbinger figures. Harbinger figures. Entities that appear not to necessarily cause disaster, but rather to announce it. Like a loud garbage truck in the background. These figures vary widely in form. Some are humanoid, others more animalistic or partially abstract, i.e. Mothman, for example, arguably functions on all three of these levels. Some are tied to specific locations, while others appear to be mobile, drifting throughout the urban sprawl or appearing at liminal boundaries such as roads, gates, rivers, bridges, and or crossroads. Yet the function remains remarkably consistent. They seem to emerge at the edges of our collective awareness when something large and destabilizing is about to occur. In this sense, the Red Man and the NAIN rouge may not be connected by shared origins so much as a shared ecological role within our folklore. They occupy what could be called the urban omen taxonomy, a symbolic function in which a figure becomes associated with the anticipatory anxiety of an entire community. Rather than representing a single spirit or individual, they become a narrative personification for the feeling that a city can sense its own vulnerability before it becomes visible in the historical records. This pattern isn't just limited to France or North America either. Similar figures appear across European folklore and beyond, often embedded within local interpretations of misfortune and political instability. What's notable is that these figures tend to persist even after the original belief systems that generated them fade away. They adapt to new contexts, new languages, new forms of media, and novel forms of storytelling, suggesting that what's actually being transmitted isn't a single myth, but a recurring structural idea, that places can produce warning signals in the form of perceived beings or entities. Once this idea is established, the Red Man of the Tuileries becomes less of an isolated apparition and more of a node within a wider system of urban symbolic behavior. The question shifts again. Instead of asking whether these figures are real or fictional, the more relevant question becomes why cities so frequently generate stories in which intelligence and agency appear to leak into the world through brief, humanoid forms at moments of intense transitions. From here, the legend of the Red Man begins to merge naturally into a broader concept, the city itself as a living system capable of producing its own mythological byproducts, or antibodies. For anyone interested in further exploring these particular baked-in citywide intelligent systems, go back and check out my Megalopolymancy episodes. Anywho, if the Red Man and the NAIN rouge are treated not as isolated curiosities, but as expressions of a shared pattern, then the focus begins to move away from individual folklore and toward the environments that generate them. Cities, particularly those with long political histories, tend to accumulate not only architecture and population, but memory, trauma, repetition, and symbolic density. Over time, these layers begin to form something that resembles narrative pressure, where events aren't only just recorded, but interpreted through recurring motifs that seem to reappear across generations. In older cosmological systems, This function would have been attributed to tutelary spirits, or city gods. The Romans described the genius loci, the spirit of a place, as something that embodied the character of a location. Chinese tradition developed complex systems of city gods responsible for overseeing civic order on both material and spiritual levels. In Japan, the boundary between landscape, infrastructure, and spirit world remains fluid, with roads, rivers, gates, and settlements all understood as potential sites of presence. These systems differ in form, but they share a common assumption that concentrated human habitation produces something more than infrastructure alone. In the modern industrial sense, these older frameworks don't disappear so much as they become fragmented and redistributed into new cultural forms. The sacred becomes symbolic, the mythological becomes psychological, the spiritual becomes anecdotal, urban legends, etc. And yet, the underlying impulse remains, now expressed through urban legends, paranormal reports, and recurring figures that appear in moments of uncertainty and transition. Within this framework, the Red Man of the Tuileries can be understood as a symbolic condensation of political instability itself. He appears at moments when systems of authority shift, institutions fracture, and historical trajectories change direction. Whether interpreted as folklore, hallucinations, symbolic memories, or something more anomalous, the consistency of his role within the narrative structure is what gives the legend its persistence. The same can be said of modern infrastructure-related encounters reported in urbex communities, where figures appear to emerge from concrete, electrical systems, tunnels, and accumulated industrial residue. Black trash bag entities. These accounts often describe environments that feel subtly animated, as though the distinction between structure and inhabitant is temporarily unstable. In these narratives, the city doesn't merely contain activity, it appears to generate forms that reflect the materials and systems it's built out of. This is just a much more up-to-date interpretation of probably one of the oldest spiritual traditions in all of mankind's history, and that would be animism. At this point, the Red Man is no longer just a historical legend. He becomes part of a continuum that stretches from ancient city spirits to modern reports of anomalous infrastructure phenomena. The question is no longer whether such figures exist in any literal sense, but whether human environments consistently produce these reoccurring experiences of presence when they reach a certain level of complexity, density, and symbolic saturation. And if that's true, then the Red Man isn't an exception. He's a pattern. And Paris isn't the only city that produces him. It's simply just one of the first where the pattern becomes visible enough to be named. By the 19th century, Paris had become one of the most concentrated centers of occult activity in all of Europe, perhaps the world, at least that we know of. Spiritualist circles, ceremonial magicians, Rosicrucian societies, and symbolic artists all operated within overlapping cultural and intellectual spaces. And that's not even counting the potentialities of international intelligence agencies as well. Figures associated with French esotericism during this period include Josephine Péladan, Stanislas de Guaita, and Abbé Bouillon, each of whom became entangled in narratives that blended mysticism, scandal, and accusations of hidden ritual practices. Again, another future series in the works. We'll take an extensive look into the many various French occultists of the Belle Epoque and fin de siècle eras, as well as the many notorious scandals that would all repeatedly find themselves embroiled in. So stay tuned for that. While these figures belong to a later historical period than the Red Man legend, their cultural environment reflects a continuation of the same underlying dynamics. Tendency for Paris to function not only as a political capital, but as a symbolic engine for ideas about hidden influences, unseen power structures, and the possibility that reality itself contains multiple layers not immediately accessible to ordinary, everyday perception. In this sense, the disappearance of the Red Man from popular legend doesn't mark the disappearance of the phenomenon he represents. Instead, it marks a transformation in how that phenomenon is interpreted. Where earlier centuries expressed it through court apparitions and omen figures, later periods expressed it through occult societies, symbolic art movements, and reports of esoteric underground networks operating within the fringes of the city's cultural imagination. The Red Man, then, may be less a ghost of the past than an early articulation of a recurring pattern in which cities generate narrative figures that appear at moments of transition. Whether those figures are understood as spirits, symbols, psychological projections, or something more ambiguous depends largely on the interpretive framework of the observer. But the recurrence itself is difficult to ignore, and as we move further into the modern era, that recurrence begins to take on increasingly technological forms. Figures of static, figures in the infrastructure, figures in reflections and distortions, figures that seem to emerge not from forests or graveyards, but from systems, from networks, from the very city itself. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte enters the mythic orbit of the Red Man tradition, the legend has already expanded far beyond the boundaries of the Tuileries Palace. What was once a courtly apparition tied to the anxieties of monarchy and revolution has become something more flexible, something that appears to move alongside history itself, rather than remain fixed within it. Napoleon, as a historical figure, is uniquely suited to absorb this kind of mythology. His life sits at the intersection of modern military rationale and a persistent aura of destiny, prophecy, and symbolic overreach. Among the many stories that accumulated around him, one of the most enduring concerns his supposed night spent inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. According to later retellings, Napoleon spent time alone within the structure during his Egyptian campaign, emerging visibly shaken and refusing to speak about what he'd experienced within. Historically, there's no reliable evidence confirming a dramatic solitary initiation event of this kind, and most historians treat the story as legend or later embellishment. Yet its persistence is what gives it its narrative weight, its gravitas. Gravy. The idea of Napoleon confronting something within the pyramid functions less as biographical and more as a form of symbolic architecture. A story in which a modern conqueror encounters an older, deeper stratum of civilization that resists any rational articulation. Within the framework of this particular episode, the significance of the pyramid narrative isn't whether it's literally occurred, but how it mirrors the function of the Red Man legends itself. Both figures appear at thresholds. Both are associated with moments where human systems of power encounter something that feels larger than their capacity to fully comprehend and interpret it. And both become embedded within the stories that suggest the presence of some hidden invisible structures beneath our visible history. Napoleon's rise and fall only reinforces this pattern. His trajectory becomes almost mythically symmetrical. Rapid ascent, imperial consolidation, expansion across Europe, and eventual collapse. Within folklore logic, such arcs tend to attract interpretive overlays. The Red Man, already associated with political transitions in earlier narratives, becomes easier to reinterpret as a kind of anticipatory figure moving through the periphery of these historical shifts, not causing events, but appearing adjacent to them, as though he or it, or whatever it was, were marking the pressure points where systems begin to change state. In this sense, Napoleon becomes less a single individual and more of a focal point in a larger symbolic network. A figure who frequently became the epicenter of stories involving hidden knowledge, forbidden encounters, and unseen influences accumulating around them. And as those stories accumulated, they began to resemble the same structural logic found in earlier accounts of the Red Man. The presence at the thresholds, appearances during times of instability, and then disappearing only once the system eventually stabilized into new configurations. What emerges is a pattern in which political history and supernatural interpretation begin to overlap and intersect in their narrative structures. Leaders naturally become surrounded by omen figures. Empires develop ghost stories, or become ghost stories. Power centers attract legends of watchers, messengers, and warning apparitions. The Red Man fits into this tradition not as an anomaly, but as merely just one particular expression of a reoccurring cultural mechanism. And once that mechanism is recognized, it becomes possible to see its echoes in other forms. As the 19th and 20th centuries progressed, the idea of political apparitions didn't disappear. Instead, they just shifted forms. Instead of palace ghosts and courtly omens, modern folklore began to describe figures that appeared around technological systems, transportation networks, and high-density urban environments. Reports of strange men in formal attire, MIB, appearing before disasters, encounters with silent observers in liminal spaces, and recurring accounts of figures that seemed to vanish when directly approached began to populate modern paranormal archives. These narratives often share structural similarities with earlier Redman accounts. The figure is typically seen briefly at a distance or in one's peripherals. There's rarely direct interaction, but instead there's timing. The appearances precede or accompany disruptions, collapse, or transformations. In the modern context, this may be expressed as accidents, failures of infrastructure, social unrest, or large-scale technological disruptions rather than dynastic collapse, but the narrative function remains consistent. Within this interpretive framework, the red man can be understood as part of a broader category of threshold apparitions, entities that appear at points where complex systems transition between states. Whether those systems are political, technological, or psychological depends entirely on the interpretive lens applied. The important continuity isn't the form of the figure, but the role it plays within human attempts to give uncertainty a narrative form. This is where modern infrastructure reports become particularly relevant. Accounts of figures emerging from electrical systems, tunnels, industrial materials, and networked environments suggest a continuation, a continuity of the same symbolic logic in a new medium. The city, now fully industrialized and digitized, continues to generate stories in which presences appear to arise from these systems themselves. Static figures in server rooms, wire-bound silhouettes moving along power-generating infrastructures, human forms perceived within or emerging from concrete, soot, or accumulated industrial residue, graffiti-covered walls that seem to contain faces that weren't created intentionally. Across all of these accounts, the underlying structure remains consistent. Dense systems produce ambiguous perceptions, and ambiguous perceptions are interpreted as a sense of presence. The red man, in this sense, isn't an isolated historical curiosity. He's an early articulation of patterns that continue to evolve as human environments become more complex. And the more complex those environments become, the more frequently the pattern seems to reappear. At the center of all these narratives lies a single, increasingly difficult question. If ancient cities produced gods, spirits, and tutelary intelligences, and if modern cities produce recurring reports of anomalous figures tied to infrastructure, transitions, and systemic failures, then what exactly is the relationship between human environments and the stories they generate? One possible interpretation is purely psychological. Human beings are pattern-seeking organisms. We think in narratives, cause and effect. And complex environments generate ambiguous stimuli that the mind organizes into narrative forms. Under this view, the red man is a symbolic construct created by cultural memory, political anxiety, and retrospective storytelling. Another interpretation is sociological. Cities concentrate human belief, and belief itself becomes self-reinforcing through repeated storytelling. Legends persist because they're useful frameworks for organizing collective uncertainty. There's also a third interpretation that runs through folklore, esoteric philosophy, and the study of anomalous phenomena. In this view, sufficiently dense systems of human activity may generate emergent forms of symbolic intelligence. Not necessarily in a biological sense, but in the sense of persistent narrative attractors, recurring patterns that appear to behave as though they're responding to the conditions of the system itself. In older language, this would have been described as, once again, the genius loci, or spirits of place. In later occult traditions, it becomes the language of egregores, thought forms, tulpas, and collective entities. In modern paranormal literature, it becomes the language of ultra-terrestrial contact, informational anomalies, and or haunted infrastructure. And in urban legend, it becomes figures like the Red Man, or the NAIN ROUGE, perhaps even Spring-Heeled Jack, and many, many others. What unites all of these interpretations is the idea that environments don't merely host stories, they produce them. And those stories, once they've taken form, tend to persist long after the original conditions that generated them have changed. Paris no longer has the Tuileries Palace. The monarchy that gave rise to the original political anxieties no longer exists. Yet the Red Man persists in folklore, not as a fixed entity, but as a pattern that continues to find new expressions whenever a city reaches a certain level of symbolic and structural density. Looking at you, Detroit. If there's a final way to understand the Red Man of the Tuileries, it may be this. He's not a ghost attached to one single location or event. He's a narrative function that emerges when human systems approach moments of transition. He appears when structures of power begin to shift, when old systems collapse into new ones, and when history itself becomes unstable enough to require symbolic representation. The palace is gone. The kings are gone. The emperor is gone. But the city remains. And the city, over time, accumulates memory, repetition, symbolic weight, repetition, etc. In earlier eras, that accumulation produced gods. In later eras, and in some instances still does, produce spirits. In modern eras, it produces anomalies that appear to emerge from infrastructure, systems, and networks themselves. And perhaps, if the pattern holds, the Red Man was never really all that unique. Perhaps he was simply just one of the earliest documented instances in which a city achieved a level of complexity required to begin generating its own warning systems. Its own omens, its own reflections, its own ghostly crimson figures standing quietly upon the fringes of history, waiting for something to change. And when it does, he's just there. Or in the case of the NAIN ROUGE, he's there, but he's running around giggling all willy-nilly. There is one last final detail worth holding on to. The Red Man of the Tuileries belongs in most tellings to an older Paris, a Paris of kings, courtiers, revolutionaries, and emperors. A Paris where political power still resides in visible places like palaces and chambers, even if unseen forces were already imagined to be moving behind them. But cities don't stop evolving their mythologies just because their governments change. As the 19th century deepened into the Belle Epoque, Paris didn't become less steeped in its occult imagination. Oh no. It became more layered, more fragmented, and in some ways more openly obsessed with hidden structures beneath the visible reality. Spiritualist salons flourished in private apartments. Ceremonial magical orders emerged from within literary circles. Artists and writers began to treat symbolism itself as a kind of hidden language embedded in the very fabric of the world. And alongside all of this, rumors again began to circulate. None of scarlet specters lurking amongst palace corridors, but of far more secretive gatherings. Hidden rituals, private circles attempting to contact forces beneath or beyond ordinary human perception. Stories that drifted through newspapers, scandal sheets, tabloids, literary salons, and whispered conversations at the edges of so-called respectable society. Whether these accounts describe literal events or the anxieties of a culture searching for hidden meaning in an increasingly modern world is less important than the continuity they suggest. The same city that once generated a figure like the Red Man, an omen tied to political collapse and transformation, later became a city saturated with claims of unseen currents, symbolic operations, and hidden intelligences operating just beneath the surface of everyday life. If the Red Man was an early expression of Paris imagining itself as something more than a city of stone and governance, then the later occult revival may represent that imagination becoming more deliberate, more organized, and more self-aware. Because the question that once took the form of a red figure in a palace hallway doesn't just disappear. It only changes language, and in Paris or Detroit, It will continue to be asked again and again in new circles, under new names, and behind increasingly guarded closed doors. But that is another story entirely, one we'll be exploring in the not-too-distant future. Woo! That's going to do it for this episode of Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. Thank you for joining me. This particular topic, I just started out as like, okay, this is like a... if you listen to any of the Megalopolomancy series, I kind of started out like, okay, this is a specific kind of cryptid, quote unquote. We'll go with that for now, that moniker, that is very much attached to a time and a place. And the more I got into it, this has opened up a lot of doors to secret history, quote unquote. And I'm not even getting close to talking about like the Belle Epoque and fin de siècle. I'm probably butchering that, whatever. Occultists, the affair of poisons, and quote unquote Satanists running around. Well, they were self-professed Satanists, but the idea of a codified system of Satanism, etc. All that, and just the overlap between art, esotericism, intelligence agencies, etc. The secret keeping apparatus or secret gathering apparatus of state powers goes off into some crazy places, and hopefully I can organize a lot of this well enough to present it to you fine, lovely people. But yeah, thanks for listening. I appreciate all the listens, the subs, the likes, the comments. Keep them coming. You guys are the fucking best, and I will see you on the next one. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. Love you guys. See you next time.
It's real shitty down here.
Oh, look. It's Redman.
Hey, where do you get these stains from with your stinking